the associated changes. And the official map update is a couple weeks later.
Very good. Anything else?
Sorry.
No, it's fine. We can wait. No.
Quick announcement that the Development Review Board last night had a special meeting and following the to reopen and consider a modified application from Beta, and this morning they issued a decision that was an approval. So
is that the Beta said they'll make do with 40 spaces, and then the airport said they'd give them another 200 if they need them?
That's correct. Yep. So they have their DRB approval. Their next step will be to get a zoning permit. But I know that was something that folks were interested in following. And so we're very pleased that they found a solution that works in a good time frame. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks for the update.
Does that mean, Paul, that the writing of regulations, which should be done by the PC, is no longer going to be done by Senator Chittenden? That was an amendment to a proposed amendment to the statute, but it's not necessary anymore because Beta has what they need.
The transportation bill that has passed the Senate, but is not the same bill as the House version, has a exemption in it essentially for that it says that a notwithstanding other parts of the state statute, that a municipal regulations cannot regulate the location of parking on or adjacent to a municipally owned airport. So it did pass the Senate version last week. The next step is some form of reconciliation between the two different versions, and it may or may not stay in. Certainly the fact that the decision has been issued by the board takes some pressure off the subject area. So
I actually have
yes, Sue.
If I can mention something very poignant that occurred at that meeting last night, when public comment was asked for, one member of the public spoke very movingly about his son who had been living in California because he couldn't find work in Vermont, being hired by Beta and being able to come home so that this man can now share his grandchildren, which he could never have done before. It was a very, very poignant moment.
Thanks, Sue.
It's not an announcement, but Paul, I was wondering, I understand at, I don't know how many city council meetings ago, the packet included a draft of some sort from Councillor Emery regarding Airbnbs. And I don't know if I think that it was offered to the council, and I just was wondering if anything came of that. Is there going to be any discussion that we have?
So the council, you're right. Councillor Emery brought forward a proposal and outline some more than thoughts, some research on the subject of short-term rentals, and the council discussed and decided that they would take it up as a priority in the next fiscal year, which starts in July. Not yet sorted where within it, but that's what they decided collectively was. So they're gonna try to wrap up the work of this fiscal year and then begin work on it in the next fiscal year. And they didn't get deeply enough into it yet to determine assignment of roles and responsibilities. It was really just the topic area and expression of interest.
Potentially something that would be heading our way, maybe.
It could be. It depends on how it's shaped. It could be either part of the land development regulations. It could be an ordinance. It could have elements of both. It could be that your collective expertise is sought, even if it's not, even if it's an ordinance that is in council. I think at this point it's just, it was a more than preliminary discussion, but a table setting for future work.
Okay, thanks.
Real quick, how does that dovetail with what the state legislature is trying to push through? I know Governor Scott has threatened to veto it, but is that a registry or?
It would be a registry of them, but not necessarily regulation. Well, it would be very basic regulations on the health and safety aspect of it, but not necessarily regulation of them as a policy matter in terms of how many, where, et cetera, et cetera. It would be mostly I think the last version that I saw was basic health and safety registration, that kind of stuff. But I think that's part of the discussion also, is what does the state wind up doing or not doing? And that could apply more broadly than just short-term rentals. That could be rentals in general, because there's not currently a statewide or a South Burlington registry of rentals, permanent or short-term.
So I have a scheduling related thing as well as an announcement. We got an email that the Chittenden County I-89 2050 study is having a public meeting during one of our meetings. Michael had brought this up by email. It's May 10th from 6 to 8 p.m. So it conflicts with our regularly scheduled meeting. We have one commissioner bring it up as a conflict. I guess I was just wondering if staff or others felt like that was something we wanted to avoid the conflict.
I think that's a discussion for you all as to what you'd like to do. Certainly it's a big project, and would understand if commissioners wanted to adjust, but at the same time, that's your call as a commission.
Yeah, I've been attending them, almost all of them, and they're interesting. Whether something new will come up on the 10th, you don't know unless you actually attend. So if others want to attend, I don't want to be the only person who causes us to change our schedule. But if others want to attend, then I'd be happy.
May 10th is probably a day I'm not going to be able to be in attendance on either. So that makes a difference. Sorry.
She would miss the May 10th meeting anyway, so doesn't want to weigh in on that particularly. Others, do we want to try to move our meeting and do both, or get an update afterwards?
I think they record them anyway, so one could see it afterwards. So
okay,
let's leave it from my point of view.
Yeah, that seemed okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we were addressing your concern. So if people want to see it, they can watch it afterwards. We'll keep our regular May 10th meeting. Anything else? Well, I guess welcome, Andrew. This is your first meeting joining us. We did welcome you last meeting.
I know. Sorry, I missed the last one.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So we did announce to the public that you were our new member and officially
very excited to be here. Thank you.
We are excited to have you, somebody with so much committee experience and personal background experience. So welcome. And you are an official full member, so you don't have to hold back or
Okay.
Actually, maybe I shouldn't say that to you.
Don't encourage me, Jessica.
Don't be bashful, Andrew.
I might regret that. I think you're not one of our more bashful members.
No, I cannot get online.
Very good. So anything else, or should we just jump in?
Yep.
I now have lost my agenda. It's committee reports though. Was there a committee report from anyone?
Well, the Climate Action Task Force is moving ahead with more alacrity than I had anticipated. I think tomorrow we will complete the first draft of the transportation sector pathways. Buildings and thermal are already in their first draft, and now there are the other sort of smaller sectors that we have to do, which are in draft form for tomorrow night's meeting. So things are moving along. I don't know if Andrew has anything to add.
Yeah, I think there's a good framework too. So each sector is kind of segmented into the key paths that we see we need to go down to achieve the goals. So for instance, for vehicles, there's kind of two pathways. One is reduce how much the car is used, VMT, and the other is transition fossil fuel cars to electric cars. And then under each of those pathways, like a series of actions that we think will be helpful to get there. And so we're kind of following that format for, all of the major categories, in addition to the ones that Michael mentioned. There's renewable energy, land use, waste, municipal, operations, resilience,
Government affairs.
yeah, maybe one or two others. And I guess the goal then would be to have kind of open this up to the public sometime in early June, I hope, for feedback. And then with a September goal of having something to present to the council. So yes, exciting.
A thought for, I guess, all of you is it might make sense as the task force is sort of wrapping up its first cut of all the sectors to maybe have set aside a little time on this group's agenda to give a little deeper dive so folks can start thinking about that, because certainly several of the areas are going to relate pretty closely to work of the Planning Commission. So, while it's still in draft form, maybe share, get some feedback, keep the lines of communication wide open.
I think that sounds good, especially in light of the comprehensive plan work that's going to be going on this year. I think, when we did the last comprehensive plan update, when we got a whole lot of comments from a committee at the very, very end, it was a little harder to incorporate them. But, I think if we kind of saw things along the way, that could be really helpful.
I would just have an Affordable Housing Committee announcement, which is that the committee is shifting to, I believe it's Monday evening meetings. I think it's 6:30, and they're shifting to,
I think it's 6 o'clock.
Monthly rather than every other week. And I informed them that I will not likely be continuing as liaison. So I don't know if you will want to discuss assigning someone else, if everyone wants to talk about it. I'll attend occasionally when I'm looking at the agenda when there's something, but I think that I'm going to step out of that role. So however you would like to proceed with that after.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all the liaison work you've done in the meantime. One thing I was thinking about is maybe when we do our reorganization meeting, we could kind of think a little bit about the liaison structure, because I know most standing committees, we don't have a liaison on. We do have representatives on kind of task forces, which are, like you were just talking about, they're more short term. And I think, maybe it's just something to consider if that's something we want to have go forward or not, or maybe only with new committees for a certain amount of time, but it might be worth a conversation before just, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, good. I'm sorry to hear that you're not going to do that, but I have to say I appreciate all the work that you've done, your diligence, and I think you went above and beyond. And
I learned a lot, that's for sure. I recommend it.
Thanks to you. You taught us a lot. Thanks.
Yeah. And one quick announcement that I forgot to mention, sort of along those lines, the council has been doing some work on helping to create more structure and consistency amongst all of the city committees, and so have been looking at an overall document and gave some feedback at their last meeting, generally a good endorsement. And one of the pieces that they endorsed was that each policy committee in the city would have a council liaison that would be selected by council annually, that wouldn't necessarily attend every meeting, but would be the conduit between that committee and the council. So there's a stronger relationship. And in the draft, the council chair would by default be the Planning Commission's liaison. And then others would be, as council sorts out their areas of expertise or interest or that kind of thing. But I think it's an exciting step in terms of having the city work together towards achieving shared common goals, which is really exciting. As we get to be a larger city, the need to do that gets more and more important. So
just a quick clarification. The next Affordable Housing Committee meeting is on a Wednesday, May 18th at 6 p.m.
So maybe it's Wednesdays.
I think it's monthly on Wednesday. It's at least the next one is on a Wednesday, and I believe that the schedule was Wednesdays.
Yes, I guess. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, which is a big change because it had been midday, I believe. So it's
They were 10:30 a.m. on Mondays by every other week.
Every other week. Yep. It's a hardworking group.
Okay, so we can move on to discussing the working draft of the transfer development rights section or TDR section for the LDRs. So this is a continuation of our discussion from last week. So for those of you following along, there was much more information in last meeting's packet as compared to this meeting's packet, which was a little short. We might refer back to some of that information.
Yeah, from the April 12th meeting, the feedback from the commission was that commissioners just wanted some more time to review and consider some of the policy questions and language in that draft. So no changes were actually made between the draft that was provided on for the April 12th meeting and what should be discussed at this meeting. So just for efficiency, referred back to the previous packet. But I did pull out the three major policy questions that I had for the commission to consider in the packet for this meeting.
I'm sorry that the changes that I suggested came so late. I only sent them to you today, Kelsey. Yeah. I'm sorry that I couldn't get it earlier, but I'm assuming that everybody else managed to see it.
I didn't. Sorry, I did not see that, Michael. Okay. I think somebody forwarded to me. I wasn't on the distribution list, which I'm sure was just an oversight, but I also didn't. I just was out of town, so my brain is a little vacation.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to review it either. I was just finishing up work. So I guess do we want to stick with kind of the three questions for starting the discussion, considering that was in the packet and people might have kind of thought about it in that order. So the first one was, should residential districts of R12, R7NC, and R7 be receiving areas for TDRs?
Is there any reason why they shouldn't be?
I don't know. It would be a change. So I think the idea is just that before we make a change, we want to affirm.
So the purpose of asking this question is the other areas where the TDR program was being expanded from the SEQ were into more mixed use or commercial areas. These three are primarily residential areas. So there is a little bit of a difference when you're expanding the program from the SEQ, where it already applies, into additional receiving areas, C1 R12, C1 R15, things like that, already fairly high density residential, commercial mixed use, and are centered on Shelburne Road, Williston Road, those areas. R12, R7, and R7NC are in slightly different geographical areas. They tend to be Heinsberg Road, Kennedy Drive, a few other areas in the city, and are primarily zoned as residential uses. So the question from a policy perspective is, do you want these overwhelmingly residential areas to be receiving areas for TDRs? Or when you were conceptualizing what it looked like for TDRs to be expanded outside the SEQ, were you thinking more of the mixed commercial residential areas like C1 R15?
And just a quick clarification that you all did discuss the last meeting, that it's R12, R7NC, and R7 within the transit overlay district.
Yes.
So that's a subset of the areas, and I can pull up a map if you'd like to see. It's not the entirety of those
It's
areas. Not
everything, and it pulls it in a little bit towards city center, towards Shelburne Road and Williston Road, and less to the sort of more outlying areas that don't currently have transit.
I asked that question because essentially, if we would like to get additional density in any place we can because of the scarcity of land. And you know, if we can get extra density in R7, R7NC, R12, whether it's in the transit overlay district or not, we need it for housing, and particularly if Chapter 18 plays a role as well.
Ed, and then Andrew.
Okay.
Ted, you had your hand up, right?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Would this include the St. John's Vianney, from there north to the curve in the road, do you know?
I believe that's not in the transit overlay district.
St. John Vianney on Heinsberg Road.
I'm sorry, yes, on Heinsberg Road. I'm sorry.
So that side of the street is all R4, so that would not include that.
Okay. But both sides, I'm saying, in other words, would it include the west side?
Not south of Market Street. North of Market Street is part of the form-based code.
Okay.
So south of Market Street, all the way to Kennedy, well, all the way to the office buildings by Kennedy Drive is all residential 4, so it would not be included.
Thanks.
And Andrew was next.
Just some basic questions to orient me. So, Paul, Kelsey, are these areas where there would otherwise be PUDs? And if so, just to understand how the two intersect.
So if a property is more than 4 acres in size in one of these, in the R7, and I believe the R7NC, then it must be one of the new PUD types. If it's under 4 acres in size, then it's not required to be a PUD. So the underlying zoning would be
So
what
let's assume it's over. How does purchasing a TDR intersect with what they're able to do? Because,
well, so let's say it's one of these medium to higher density districts, and if it's more than the 4 acres, then the new regulations would, under most circumstances, make that a traditional neighborhood PUD type. In that PUD type, there is no more density. So it is calculated, the amount of housing that you can do is calculated based on the arrangement of the building types that you put together, single families, 2 families. So it doesn't naturally intersect with TDRs especially well.
right.
In the Southeast quadrant, what was done where TDRs have long existed was there's sort of there's an artificial cap on density, and above that, in the places that you can do this traditional neighborhood, you can theoretically do as much housing as you want that fits in it, but you have to buy TDRs to do it.
So
it's a little bit of you've got 2 policies that are sort of pushing up against
kind of
one
tweak
another.
here, then put an artificial cap to make the purchase of TDRs meaningful.
Yes, so you could do something like anything over the underlying density of, say, R7 to 7 units an acre could be achieved, but only with TDRs. Okay. I guess what I would say is that TDRs are a really great tool for transferring development from one area to another area. They do obviously represent an expense at one end. And
sure.
So that's always the
transfer wealth.
Right.
Yeah.
So for an area that is currently eligible to do essentially sort of unlimited development, to then have to buy TDRs represents an expense to do so. Yeah. And so that's 2 policies that you all need to wrestle.
And sorry, just one more question. And if these districts were, or these areas were kind of tweaked that way, is the thought it would be 1 TDR per 1.2 new homes, the same kind of underlying?
So that's the second question there. So the draft was provided suggests that in areas of high priority, like say Shelburne Road, 1 TDR, which is equal to 0.83 acres, is equal to 1 house in the Southeast quadrant, but it could be equal to 3 dwelling units on Shelburne Road to incentivize its use in certain areas. That's up to you guys to decide if that's the policy that you'd like to pursue, how you want to incentivize and use them.
Right, and Andrew, just for a little bit of background, at the April 12th meeting, there was some discussion amongst commissioners about whether that sort of incentivizing by providing more value in different areas was even something that the commission wanted to do. So that's why the second question remains are there places that TDRU should be incentivized, and should they be incentivized in that way that they're, it's worth double or triple in certain areas than in others?
Monica?
So back to what Michael's comment was, I completely agree. I am opposed to TDRs only being allowed to go to the urban overlay district. I would like to point out that I believe not a single planning commissioner lives in the urban overlay district. Right? I don't think any of us live in the urban overlay district.
Paul does.
Yeah. Paul Engels, that's urban overlay district. Okay.
Yeah.
So I am mindful, I've made my comments before about being concerned about some aspects of that, and the going to the incentivizing for higher density and such. I like what Michael was saying, and I agree. And I think that wherever there's an opportunity within the R12, R7, and R7 that works with the PUDs, I am in sync with what Michael is saying.
So I guess just to be clear, I guess I think that Andrew's comment was a really good one. So if we've already allowed for or required the TND neighborhood, which doesn't use density, how would these districts actually use the TDRs if
I believe
they don't need to use them?
I believe it'd still be available on smaller parcels. So you only need to do the PUD, the TND PUD over a certain acreage, and under certain acreage, which there are significant numbers of lots that are under that. I think it's 4 acres. There are significant number of lots that could be developed for higher numbers of units, but are not required to do a TND. And Paul can correct me if I am misinterpreting that.
And Paul, how does that relate to the not infill PUD, but the small parcel future potential conversation that we might have? Because I mean, yeah, is it even?
So there are ways to, the simplest way to increase density on a parcel is to increase density on the parcel. Increase the R7 to R10, or take the R12 to R18 or something else. That's the simplest. It's the simplest way to increase density. There's no money changing hands. You lose the conservation side of the TDR process. But that would allow for greater numbers of units on small lots as one aspect of what you've talked about at certain times, by just allowing additional density without TDRs. And that's a different policy conversation.
And I guess just to, I agree, and what I would add, Monica, is these districts here that Kelsey has highlighted are sort of our in-between districts. They tend to be multifamily housing already. If you go lower than R7, you move in most cases towards areas where it's single family, duplex, triplex housing. The R7 tends to be multifamily housing. So from a, what does it look like if you, what does quote unquote infill look like in the future? I think in our view, it might look somewhat different in the R1, R2, R4 districts, where it is likely to be sort of one unit at a time. Somebody says in their backyard, oh, maybe I'll try to put a unit in my backyard, or they'll say, I've got a house that's too big. Could I split it up like the old Victorian homes were split up in Burlington several decades ago? Whereas I think when you get to the R7s, it's a little bit of a different conversation as to what form that takes. And, it's sort of it's the top of the teeter-totter. as to whether you sort of think of those as being the high density districts where somebody's going to be taking advantage of buying 10 TDRs at once, or you think of it being the lower density where more likely you're going to see 1 or 2 units at a time being built rather than a bunch.
Michael had his hand up and then.
Yeah, Kelsey, you said in the smaller lots, you lose the conservation aspect of it?
I was just saying, if you just across the board increase density in a district, then you're not getting the flip side of the TDR equation. You're not getting the conserved land in the SEQ that someone needs to, separate from that land in the SEQ to then apply to somewhere in the R7 if you take the R7 to 10 or 12.
I'd take issue with what Paul said, that the TDRs is for transferring density from one place to another. It's also a major conservation tool.
Andrew and then Duncan.
So just understand the under 4 acre parcel. Just understand the under 4 acre parcel. So for these districts, is there a difference between base density and maximum density like in the SEQ, or is it R7? The density can go up to 7 without the purchase of TDRs today.
Correct.
So it's the latter.
Today,
so to make the TDRs meaningful for the under 4 acre parcels, you'd say it's R7, but you can go to R10 with TDRs. That's how it would work?
yes, you could choose to put a cap or not put a cap, but yes, today there is no, outside of the southeast quadrant, there's no base and then upper, it's just an upper. There is a inclusionary affordable bonus that you can get today citywide, but that's sort of a side conversation.
Duncan?
Yeah, no, my my question had to do with the 4 acre threshold too. I mean, any idea in the R7, R7NC, and maybe the R12, what percentage of parcels available for development are 4 acres and under? I mean, I'm just wondering what the threshold and how many pieces were. I'm just trying to figure out what's the, are we talking about the majority of them are under 4 acres, or is it split evenly?
There's not a ton. This is basically
over 4 or under 4.
Period. So
okay.
This on the screen here, this is a super quick map. So apologies for the sketchy drawings, but this is basically the areas with a couple of very minor exceptions that are zoned R7, R7NC, or R12 in the transit overlay district. Most of this is currently built. There are some individual parcels like right here at the southwest corner of Heinsberg Road and Kennedy Drive is a vacant parcel. You know, there probably could be some infill or redevelopment. Say, you know, somebody could take up part of the parking lot of the fitness Edge Sport and Fitness, that kind of thing. But for the most part, this is a relatively built out district.
And if we were to expand it outside of the transit overlay district, what would be the
the other areas there that would fall into that would be, there's a few parcels up on Quarry Hill Road that are in the R7 or the R12 district, but are not considered part of the transit overlay district, because even though they look like they're really close to Williston Road, they're not easy to get to Williston Road. So when the commission set up the transit overlay district, that's not really transit accessible. There's a couple of parcels in there, at least one of which is very, very steep. And then there are a handful of parcels that you rezoned in the last round of amendments south of the interstate on the west side of Heinsberg Road.
The Hill Farm.
Hill Farm and the two properties next to it, I think our suggestion at this point, given that that's so new, is to maybe not do further adjustments to it in the immediate term in that area. So I think our recommendation would be, if you're choosing these areas, to stick to the transit overlay district.
And I know there's been a few times in the summertime and then also in the fall where we talked about kind of first focusing on the transit overlay district and kind of those areas where there was broad agreement in the community and already that kind of type of housing might be a little more expected rather than like the R4 and a little more rural areas. So, I mean, it seems consistent with what we've been talking about, you know, to stick to the transit overlay district for now. You know, if that's agreeable to the group.
But I'm sorry, go ahead, Naga.
Sorry, thanks, Duncan. I'm seeing an area, Paul, up on the, it does not look like it's in the transit overlay district, but maybe it is. What is this area here?
That was the Quarry Hill area.
Oh, that's the Quarry Hill. Oh, I
Yeah.
thought it was right. See, I don't know if there's any more opportunity for growth there, but I don't know what the problem would be in including that. Especially with the pedestrian bridge coming. Certainly seems like a not good opportunity.
I think, but if we include that, do we also have to include the property south of the interstate? I think that's more the issue based on what's going on down there.
What's south of
The Hill Farm.
Well, but there are 7, they're part of this.
The Hill Farm is R7 and C, and the Quarry Hill Road parcels are R7 or R12. They're in different districts, so you could tweak the wording to include all R7 and all R12, but only R7 and C within the transit overlay. It starts to really slice and dice.
I don't have an issue with including it. I mean, we're personally, I personally
Well,
don't have an issue
I
with
guess
including
my other suggestion about something for you to think about specific to the area of Quarry Hill Road is R7 and R12. The remaining parcels are directly against up against the East Terrace single family home neighborhoods. So you know, that's up to you guys. Certainly you know, it's well understood that there's a need to think about how to do infill housing, but there's been a lot of concern in that neighborhood about that, which has already happened. So just sort of given the context of the remaining ones are literally right up against the single family homes.
Andrew?
So would it be possible just to, I don't know, Paul, if you can overlay within the black, you know, enclosed areas, the natural resource attributes, just to get a feel for how close dense housing may be to sensitive areas or not.
Let's see. Yes, we can do that. Resume share. Let's see.
That's a good question. There are likely some because of the potash.
Green that I've popped on, that's the habitat blocks. The dark green is the habitat connectors. This is like a dry run of the first time I've got all this data together in one place. So we'll see if it all works. That's the possible class 2 wetlands, the floodplains. Yeah, those are probably the main ones I can see. Yeah, so those are all, I don't have the steep slopes in there right now. I don't believe anything in this black other than possibly a little bit of Old Farm Road, but that's frankly all being built out right now.
And can you zoom in again on the areas you were suggesting could benefit from the increased density?
Sure. So one parcel that is essentially vacant is right here at the corner of Kennedy Drive. Let me see if I can see what happens. I blow everything up if I do this. Yeah, so there's a parcel right in here that's pretty much vacant at the corner of Kennedy Drive and Heinsberg Road. It's hard to know when there might be an opportunity for infill. You know, I would have said 10 years ago that this senior housing was built out, but then they figured out how to put 3 sixplexes in front of it. And they were able to do that because senior housing doesn't count as density per se. So it had the back been apartments, they might not have been able to do that front. So that's an example of where a little bit of infill might have worked. You know, would there be an opportunity to see something associated with the medical offices that are here? possibly, or, you know, I don't know what's going to be happening with the market in the coming years. We've got a couple of office buildings here. Could a building like this see an opportunity, if the density was right, to say, similar to the People's Bank in downtown Burlington, we're ready to convert over to housing? It might be that they would say, you know, I haven't done the math. Maybe they can do 12 units today, but if they were given the opportunity to be 20, that they would do it because it's a 3-story building. I'm speculating, but we are seeing a little bit of that happening now, especially sort of hybrid things. The DRB has a couple of projects in front of them where folks are seeing some underused commercial space and are finding an opportunity to put a handful of units. That's probably doable under the existing zoning in most cases. But if somebody were thinking about a wholesale conversion, like, you know, I'm not trying to start a rumor with this building, but if they were to take this building and say, we're ready for this to be entirely residential, they may not have the density to do it.
I'm thinking of, was there somebody else? About, you know, redevelopment in already built up areas. I can't think of an example, but let's say the property that belongs to the Champlain Housing Trust just north of the fire department on Dorset Street.
Mm-hmm.
Now they may decide, it's all single level and, you know, not efficient use of the land. They want to rebuild, tear down and rebuild, but they want to make it really dense and affordable. So they could use TDRs to get the extra density if we don't narrow it down too much. I mean, one of the objectives of doing the review of the TDRs was to expand the market as much as possible. And in my view, the side benefit, or as I said before, is density and affordability in the areas that are on transit routes. That's on Dorset, the example I gave. So it fits, but there are others. You know, I might have an old house that is falling apart, and I want to tear it down and build something that's three times the volume. Maybe not on one level, same footprint, but extra building bulk.
So I think the only question I'd have for you, Michael, with that, for the commission to consider is, are there circumstances, and the R7, you know, might be sort of that transition area, where you would want to put some physical building scale guideposts to it? Because most of our districts, like these, don't using that as an example as Champlain Housing Trust buildings, would it be okay if it were to rebuild as 4-story buildings? That might be perfectly fine. I just wanted to sort of draw your attention to, we don't have in most districts strong building scale guideposts like we do, let's say, in the form-based code, and so if you wanted to pair that to say, and the form must be X, you know, you can put as much density as you want, but it can't be more than 3 stories or something like that. You may want to think about whether there's areas where that's appropriate. Did you lose?
But in the general PUD, we have context.
That's what I was gonna.
Yeah.
Or is that just me?
Paul, we do have context in the general PUD, which
Yes.
would apply.
If they applied as a PUD. Well, yes, you do. And you have context now in the site plan standards that you just put forward. They're not hard and fast rules. And so it is for the DRB to interpret, but yes, you're right.
So, but what, I guess, like, we have the option, you know, there were only a few districts that in our draft, we had the no maximum density. For most of the other ones, and in fact, it's actually drafted so that these 3 districts are in the category which would have 50% more than the base density allowed. So I guess in the interest of like moving along, I'm gonna maybe take a straw poll on if people are comfortable with the R12 R7NC and R7 as drafted being in the category of allowing for the TDR increases up to 50% more of the base density? Who would be in favor of that?
Yep.
Okay. So it sounds like we answered one question.
And as a reminder, though, there is also still the inclusionary there, which it will not conflict with, but it will be another, well,
Yes.
Right, that's something we'll need to reconcile with the commission. Once you've given some guidance, we'll have to reconcile how do those two talk with one another.
Would a developer, a builder, though, have a choice to either build additional affordable units in order to get the bonuses or buy TDRs?
I think that that's an option that you can certainly consider. There's an offset for what they have to do that I think you probably will need to retain, because the state law says if you're going to require inclusionary, you have to provide offsets. But in terms of the bonus beyond there, I think you all can discuss whether you want to have them be additive or optional. And I think that would be a good next conversation.
So just in terms of the straw poll, Jessica, was that just for under 4 acres or for also over 4 acres?
It was for wherever it would apply and within the transit overlay district, because that's what we had been talking about. That's, I guess, what I meant by that.
Well, I guess Andrew's brought up an important question, because over 4 acres, there is no density cap today. So this would be, because it's a TND, you'd be essentially creating a cap to then allow.
Yeah, so I didn't create a cap with that. So it would only really apply to the smaller parcels, I guess, with that.
Right, but I guess is that something though we should talk about, because you're kind of creating some disparity now. Someone owns a 3.9 acre parcel versus a 4.1 is treated very differently in the same district, and it kind of seems odd.
Well, it's a good point. I mean, I think that it's that way already. So our current rules say, well, I guess, yeah, our current rules say that over 4 acres has to be a TND and has no density cap. And under 4 acres is just the regular zoning.
Well, just as a quick clarification, there's no density cap, but there are a lot of other requirements in the TND. There's a lot of requirements and regulations on building type and percentages, and there's a lot of other things that go into the TND. So it's not like you can suddenly build, 4 40-unit buildings in a TND. There's a lot of other regulations that do apply. So technically there's no density cap, but everything else playing into the same thing.
Very heavily designed.
It's very heavily designed. And so there,
I mean, it seems to me worthwhile to talk about, should there be a cap, understanding that there's a trade-off, that you are making a conservation versus affordability trade-off there potentially, and just probably something to discuss and address.
You're talking about over 4 acres?
Right, over 4 acres, right? If right, the commission decides that, right, over 4 acres, your maximum density is, let's say, 12 or 7, whatever the underlying zoning would call for. But if to go over that, this is the same rule, right? 50% over that, 50% with TDRs to be put those parcels on the same footing as the smaller parcels, understanding that now if they say if an R12 were to go to 13, they'd have to pay for that, right? Make those houses a little more expensive, but also buy some conservation.
Right now, over 4 acres in the TND, it's building type that's going to determine the density. Is that correct? Yes. Which is not the case if you're using TDRs under 4 acres.
Yeah, just as you could apply the same rule, right? So if you're an R7 and you do your whole PUD plan, and you can choose to use the building types to design a neighborhood with 7 units per acre, or you can choose to design something with 10 units per acre. But if you go to 10 and you say you're allowed to go to 10 and a half with a 3% bonus, you got to pay for it.
And yeah, like we do in the southeast quadrant.
Yeah, or like we're proposing to do with the under 4 acre parcels.
Can I make a suggestion to maybe help move this conversation forward? It's a really interesting idea. I'm not sure in these districts whether there are any 4 acre parcels. Can we do a little analysis of that and come back to you rather than having, if it winds up being moot, then I can save you a debate.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Jessica, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
We just decided that yes, we were fine with the R7NC, R7 and R12 within the transit overlay district. Okay.
Yeah.
And can I just say, if it does look like there are some 4 acre or less parcels, to me, the concern may be in those smaller parcels that if their neighbor is 4.1 acre and they're to do a TND and have all these design requirements and their neighbor is at 3.9 and they don't have to, and they can buy TDRs, they may end up with more density, but don't have to follow the design regulations. So that's something to think about as well.
Yep.
It might be creating, if they're,
Would the subdivision regulations take care of that at all? Would subdivision regulations guide any of that? I would.
Certainly, there's elements of it that would be, you have more robust site plan standards. Now your subdivision regulations and your site plan standards would say that there needs to be a minimum amount of civic and open space. The subdivision regulations set some pretty clear block standards so that the scale of things will always be a neighborhood feel, even if the size of the things within it are different. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the next question was, how should TDRs be used? How should TDR use be incentivized in specific areas? So we did start to talk about this at our last meeting. And there is in the draft some incentive given to the higher density districts. In the case in this draft here, one dwelling unit, we've got this chart here. So essentially one unit from the SEQ could stay as one unit in the SEQ districts as it is now. But if you were going to transfer that unit to one of the higher density districts, you could actually build more units for just using the one TDR. So I think there was some feeling that 3 felt excessive.
Jessica, I'm actually wondering, do we discuss any of this yet? Because if there are no parcels in which it seems like there's a strategic question to Andrew's point, which is that if all of these potential zoning districts will require a PUD if they're over 4
Right, no. So I was specifically speaking to the R7 C1LR.
Yeah.
All of the other districts, well, other than the SAQ, only have the general PUD. So there is no TND in those areas. Therefore, density is entirely a discussion of yours. The only thing that exists in those districts, C1R15, C1 Auto, C1, everything on the first line and most of the next 2 lines are just guided by the numerical density in the city.
Okay. Yeah, good question.
It's a very appropriate discussion.
Yeah, I thought we thought that 3 might be a bit excessive for a start. So I thought 2, 2, 1, and in my note I put a half instead of 1 in the SEQ zones, because we want as much open space as we can, and that might work in favor of that. So it's just an idea. So a half for the bottom row, then 1, 2, 2.
Okay, interesting. So the half wasn't brought up at the last meeting with the upper, Monica?
So and I'm interested in Andrew's perspective on this. I would like to remind everybody that the sooner we can sell off all of the TDRs, the closer we are to permanently conserving everything that's marked as NRP. And so I am not in support of incentivizing any. I'm interested in just keeping them as a starting point at 1. And I just looked up the cost of like what it costs to build a apartment building of 20 units. And it's a range of anywhere from $3 to $20 million, probably plus. We were concerned about if we offered the opportunity for them to have more density, that we would need to further incentivize. And I'm still not convinced that we do. I say, if we start out with 1-to-1, I don't see the expense being that significant that it would be a deterrent. And we've heard developers say, I think, well, one particular developer say, cost didn't seem to be the concern. So, and I know we all discussed it, and Andrew wasn't here, which is why I just offered to get his response on it. But I still, that's where my position still stands.
I'm wondering, certainly the goal should be for the, landowners that were zoned NRP to be able to sell their TDRs off at the end of the day, right? If TDRs kind of remain, unsold with no market, that's the NRP kind of infrastructure maybe didn't work that well. So I'm wondering whether or not to aid this decision, it's possible for staff to do a little work to figure out, okay, right now, and we have some of this, how many TDRs are there? And, if we were to play with these formulas, how many do we think might be purchased, and kind of maybe just have a little bit of guide to frame that discussion to see how we think we might achieve balance?
So the last number that I think we have, which is a few years out of date at this point, is around 1,400.
Unsold.
Yes.
So they're more now.
So
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't know if there's a way to kind
Okay,
of.
and that's before the most recent LDR.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm not opposed to staff doing an analysis, but it does seem like our big goal that we heard from your committee was to create new locations for them to go, and specifically new locations outside of the SEQ. So like, it seems to me if there's no opposition to people maybe buying them, maybe there is no incentive at this point. And if somebody wants to put those units in one of these higher districts, that seems like a good thing. And maybe they would buy.
I agree. I guess I'm just trying to, in my own mind, figure out what the framework is for figuring out, should it be a half, 1, 2, 3? And, it seems to me that setting that math should be thought about in terms of how do we best achieve a balance.
And, I guess one thing that and this is a question for the group, if we have a balance, it means that we wouldn't achieve a full program until everything's completely built out. And, I don't know if that's something that, the landowners or the city who's trying to protect the NRP wants to wait until everything's built out. So I guess a question for me is a balance the right thing? Because that's what we've had in the SEQ with the, the NRP doesn't get conserved until a building is built. And, how.
No, fair enough. I probably overlay that with a dose of realism.
Yeah. Do we want to speed it along a little bit by just having them sold?
I would certainly advocate, as was the case when you first adopted the TDRs, that there be at some more amount of receiving than sending areas. Because the one situation you don't want to be in is that they are TDRs that can't be sold at all. So if you're going to be off balance a little bit, it should be tilting in that direction. But yeah.
Duncan?
No, I was looking, I spent a lot of time looking at this chart. I forgot what all these acronyms were, so I forgot some of them. But I kept thinking about what is our purpose, and our purpose is to create a more robust market for the TDRs. And that's really what we're trying to do, to get them sold. So I'm okay with us trying to incentivize certain areas. I do agree. I think, Jessica, you might have said, I think 3 might be a little much. I would be okay with going down to 2 at that top line. I also did have a question. We split out Allen Road and Swift down here, but we didn't above, in the chart above. was there, in the chart above, Allen Road and Swift are both in the additional 50%, but down here, we split them up. It seems that seems a little inconsistent to me. I don't know if we need to move Allen Road down to one dwelling unit.
So I did do that intentionally. I don't remember the exact specifics, but it has to do with what is already allowed in those areas. What's already allowed is different in Allen Road versus Swift Street. And what zones are around them are different. So there was a little bit of trying to keep it consistent with zones that are transitional from one to the other. You know, Allen Road transitions up to R1. Swift Street has some other zones around it. I don't remember the exact specifics, and I can definitely answer that question. But there was some thought put into it. It wasn't, just to clarify, it wasn't a typo.
No, I guess in my mind, I was thinking they should be in the 19.2, they should be on the same line. That was my feedback on that. But I would be okay dropping 3 down to 2. We can always go up. I don't think we can go down.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, Duncan,
That's my concern.
Yeah, we can't say, okay, you had 3, now you only get 2.
The marketing world,
Yeah,
when you're
no.
setting prices, I don't advise.
You can go from 2 to 3, but going from 3 to 2, yeah.
Well, I guess, would you consider just putting them all at 1? So we're not, you know, to your point of, we don't want to give too much away, or.
I guess if one of the key goals is to incentivize it, it's the relative cost of a TDR in a 800 square foot apartment will be higher than a TDR for a 3,000 square foot home. So, you know, multiply it times 50 dwelling units, you may find that if one of the goals, as Duncan says, is to get them used, you may want to make it not just comparatively attractive, but attractive, period, to some extent on a place like Shelburne Road, so that they decide, because they're not going to buy them as 1 or 2, they're probably going to buy 20. It's hard to say what the market's going to do, but yeah.
Andrew?
So Paul, I forget, but does the statute give kind of flexibility, just to your thought, to say instead of a unit, you know, TDR is more square footage, which maybe translates into additional units, so that it you know, kind of self-regulates, right? Each TDR is 1,000 square feet, and if you buy,
so yes,
and you figure out how many units are by the average square foot of your dwelling or something like that.
It can be done that way, yes. The statutes speak about building bulk, building area, things like that. The tricky thing that we talked about a little bit last time is that, let's take Shelburne Road. Right now, there are dimensional standards on the building overall. So you can build in parts of Shelburne Road a 5-story building that has setbacks of 30 feet and has a total lot coverage of, say, 40%. You could build that entire thing out as an office building or as X number of dwelling units, but not X number of dwelling units plus whatever others. So what happens is that on a place like Shelburne Road, you get capped on your units before you would get capped on the building bulk you're allowed to do. So people underbuild the property, frankly. For example, the Bartlett Brook apartments that were built on Shelburne Road, that used all of the land area of everything in front of it, everything on the other side of the ravine over towards the Lake House, former Lake House restaurant that happens to belong to them. They used everything around there to build that one building. So they could not build another unit, even if the market called for it, as a for instance. But they've got plenty of additional space to build buildings. They just can't add any more units. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Monica?
I do think that incentivizing the 3 would potentially create more studio and 1-bedroom. And I can tell you that in a recent Affordable Housing Committee meeting, and they were doing something separate about the grant application, I'm ARPA funds, I'm sorry, I'm like so out of it. But there was a general consensus that of concern that making it too making it too easy for apartment developers to build rentals of studios and 1-bedrooms only is a concern. We need families who, you know, will need this kind of housing price. We need people leaving abusive relationships and basically living on nothing to be able to afford a place where they can live with their children. And when a family has to live in a 1-bedroom, it's extremely stressing. So I would put that out there. It's the quality of the people inside the building too that concerns me with that. And I believe, I'm not sure, you will know more about this, but generally when they're building the building, we've talked about adding, you know, allowing additional floors. Do they tend to have the same floor map over and over?
More or less.
Yeah, because it makes the plumbing easier, you know.
Yeah, they tend to, a lot of what we've seen that's completely market rate in the last few years has been mostly 1-bedrooms with 2-bedrooms on sort of the end parts of buildings where it's a little more attractive to do that, and an occasional studio where there's like, you know, some quirky element to the building where it just doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're seeing in the completely market rate part of it recently. You know, that could change as the market evolves, but that's been the last few years.
Okay.
So just to circle back to Duncan's question, because I did find the answer, and it may become a moot point if everyone wants to go with 1 dwelling unit regardless, but if not, I did separate Allen Road and Swift Street because the maximum residential density currently in Allen Road is 12. So I clustered it with the other 12s, where Swift Street is 7. So it ended up clustered with the other 7s. But in the previous table, I kept it with other things that felt similar, as because they are both sort of more transitional neighborhoods or zones from denser to less dense areas. So that's how they ended up in that second line instead of in the first or third.
So on that, I do think that when on the TDR committee, that is an area that we looked at raising the density with TDRs, the Swift Street. Didn't we look at that going up to 12?
Yep.
Map. So though it is zoned at the R7, I believe the committee looked at Swift Street in particular as being an area that could go up to the 12.
Yeah, so the way the draft is currently written, the maximum density is the same in Swift as in the other zones that have 12 as a base. It's the same formula. It doesn't go up to the same number, but it's the same additional density. So you could change that with TDRs, or you could change Swift to have a 12 unit density for multifamily as a base density. Those are other options.
So should we take, I'm sorry.
Just to ask a question to follow up to Monica's point about the mix. So are there other standards now in the regulations in terms of the mix of different types of units in these, you know, you need to have 30% 1-bedroom or 30% 2. Are there, do we have that?
There is a requirement that when you trigger the inclusionary, so the affordable component, the number of bedrooms in your inclusionary units must be equal to or greater on average than the number of bedrooms in your market rate ones. Other than that, there is no requirement in the regulations that says you need to be 20% 2-bedrooms or anything like that. That's
so
certainly a component of what you could talk about.
Maybe something to put on the work plan. I'm not sure it impacts the TDR decision, but it seems like it's something to think about.
It came up during the general PUD, and I did ask that we look at that, and that it was not the majority. interest. I asked that we look at, as we did with the PUDs requiring certain housing, 3 different housing types. I asked that we require 2 to 3 different unit sizes. But I think that was not, so it's something to maybe look at again, maybe in a different context, but I thought the general PUD was a good place for that.
But in the TND, you've got to have 3 different types, and
There's
none of them can be more than 50%.
There's 3 different types of housing.
Yep.
It doesn't dictate the number of bedrooms.
No.
Now, most likely if you're building a single family home, you're gonna have more than 1 bedroom. So it will shake out that way, but there's nothing to Andrew's specific question that says X% needs to have 3 or more bedrooms or more than 1 bedroom, anything like that. There's nothing in our regulations that says that today.
That is actually something that I requested to add to the work plan about the type of units, because, it's something that Monica brought up a few weeks ago that, if we are transferring the development from the Southeast quadrant, where it's primarily single family homes, typically would have larger numbers of bedrooms and kind of that type of housing. What does that mean for our community if all that housing is then going into these districts, which have a very different type of housing and maybe are only 1 bedrooms, and it makes for a really different housing stock. So that's one of the things that you'll see on the work plan. Yeah.
So should we figure out a way to vote either like a straw poll of that first option and then 22211? I'm not sure how we proceed with getting a decision.
Yeah. Does anyone want to keep the 3 dwelling units?
No.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah,
I think we should start at 2 and see how TDRs are used in the next few years, and then we can increase. If they're not selling, you can always go up.
Okay, so now next question. How about the idea of 2-2-1-1? Who's in favor of that? Okay, and so that was a lot. Monica, did you have a different thing you'd like us to vote on?
I just the 1-1-1-1, and I know that I won't be surprised. I mean, I'm
based on that.
no
Okay.
worries.
Great.
I think Monica's is a very valid point from they'll sell faster than
you will protect more land faster, which I thought was a concern. And my profession was in marketing and price setting. So
I'm not sure that's true. Can we just flesh it out? Because if I thought that was true, I might think differently about this, because there's supply and demand, right? And so if a developer knows that he or she can get 2 units for buying 1 TDR, the developer might be incented to buy more than if they had to pay the whole TDR was only 1 unit, right? So I'm just not sure that that's true. I guess my thought in thinking that 2 or 3 made sense was to incentivize the market to sell them faster.
I guess we don't know till we're doing it.
No, we don't.
Yeah. I guess there is a 3rd option that we haven't talked about. If we go back to that table, Paul, on the next page, is that not to make this more complicated, but we could make this so that only that first line of the very densest parts of our city have the 2, and then that more kind of moderate zone of the R12, like that second line, could be 1, to be a little more conservative, so that we're really okay. So who would be in favor of 2-1-1-1?
Can I add a consideration to that, though?
Yeah, sure.
In that largest area, would you be willing to do that if you also tied it to a unit number of bedrooms? Because that's exactly the area where you can have large buildings of studios and 1-bedroom apartments and not include, there'd be nothing in all of that density, nothing that would require a 2-bedroom apartment. And it's giving the most incentive and it is the most likely probably to be rental. It might be a difficult, there could be ownership within that, but we haven't had that conversation yet. So I just would ask, if you were to do that, would you consider tying it to bedroom count?
Can I play devil's advocate on that? My concern would be, is the developer just going to take the easiest path? Go, I'm just going to build commercial. If we put too many strings on it, I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea on your part, but I guess, Paul, that maybe it's a question for you. Do you think would we disincentivize it by putting too many strings on it?
I think it's not necessarily a disincentive, because right now somebody could build it all commercial. So anything that you're creating in your discussions today is creating more market opportunity on the residential side. It's really a question of how much more do you want to incentivize it? So today you've got your residential caps. They could just build it all at commercial today. Mm-hmm. You're creating new opportunities for housing that might create a new market opportunity. The question is how do you say pour gasoline on it in an energy climate kind of way?
Turn up the amps.
How do you turn up the amps? How much do you want to turn up the amps on it? The most extreme way that you would turn up the amps is not to do TDRs at all. You just say no density cap, period. Similar to the form-based code. Anything between what you have today and that is creating new market opportunities. It's just how much do you want to turn up the amps versus the other objectives that you've got, I guess, is what this comes down to.
But Monica, are you suggesting, because I guess I kind of thought that your idea of, requiring a mix of housing in these areas makes a lot of sense. And I would fully support that on the work plan. But are you suggesting that should only be the case when someone buys a TDR, or it should always be the case?
If there's going to be an incentive, I was tying it to an incentive that's greater than one. I mean, remember, we just said that there's how many TDRs that we need to sell? 1,400 plus all the new ones. Okay, so let's say,
16.
Let's just say that everybody took up that offer and they just built 1-bedrooms and studios, a whole bunch of them, but they still have to get now to 1,500 times 3 in order for us to protect all of the NRP. That's a lot of units. I don't know if we're ever going to.
I guess what I'm saying is, it seems to me that if in connection with the package, on the work plan, you require a mix of housing in these areas, with or without TDRs, that maybe is a more equitable and just more, I don't know, necessarily needs to be tied, I guess is what I'm saying. There should be a mix of housing or mix of unit size. And in addition, I think there should be a bonus for TDR purchase.
No, I agree. I don't know where we fit the unit mix of housing, because we did discuss that and it didn't fit into the general PUD. So I don't know what other mechanism there would be. It came up during that time. So I guess I'm trying to find where I can, I would say, because it didn't fit into the general PUD. So I don't know where that would come up.
Well, I mean, that's up to you guys generally. I think, to the point of the general PUD, it's a similar conversation to the TDR, which is that's a subset of the development. So I think, your question, Andrew, is a good one of, do you want, if you were to say, I don't know, I'll just pick a number, 15% or 25% of all dwelling units must be at least 2 bedrooms. I'm just making a number up. You could have that apply to a subset or to just anything that you're building more than X number of units, period. You're building 10, 12, whatever dwelling units, that's your requirement, regardless of the tool used for it, or you connect it to a bonus like a TDR. And that's
so it. So what I was saying is, if you're going to incentivize the TDR, why not add that in? Because that may make adding 2 bedrooms that much easier for them. And then, you're incenting selling more TDRs and conserving more land. And ensuring that you're getting a mix of housing, which there isn't another way to confirm right now. So.
Paul, per your point though, where if we don't do what Monica says, where would that reside? Would that be in the subdivision? Where would that be? I mean, where would we?
I guess that would go in either site plan or just it goes in the underlying zoning district. You could say in site plan or in that zoning district, pick one of these C1R15. Any development exceeding X number of units must have at least 20% 2 bedrooms, or that can be just stated.
Because I hear what you're saying, Monica, and I think it's a good idea. I just don't know if tying it to the TDRs would dampen the market a little bit.
I think it depends whether if you do want that kind of requirement to only apply in certain districts, then you can put it in the specific districts. If you wanted to apply citywide, there's some space to put it in the site plan, possibly, in the way that's where we ended up landing with the civic space and site amenities things. Instead of that being in the PUDs, it applies to everything now because we put them in subdivision and site plan. Because if you put it only in the TDR, it only applies to the buildings that use TDRs. And so is that accomplishing what your goal would be?
I mean, I'm just bringing up an unrelated goal, trying to sneak it in there. But by the way, I don't know that, and I don't remember if this is coming from me now or if it was part of the Affordable Housing Committee discussion, but using percentages would be very potentially too prescriptive. And instead, what we do in the PUDs is just say, you must include 3 different types. Leave it at that. They can figure out, because they probably are going to have each floor consistent. So rather than making a numerical requirement, if you just, on terms of like 15%, if it's just, you just have to include 3 different types. You can't only be studios. You can't only be 1 bedrooms. You got to have a mix, period.
Yeah.
So I do agree it should go everywhere, but especially if there's going to be an incentive to start with, I would put that in. That's just me.
And not to go too deeply down this rabbit hole, but it's a really interesting idea and has a lot of merit. I think, at least from my perspective, I do think there are some careful pitfalls that we need to think about a little bit, like Champlain Housing Trust is doing a conversion to create transition housing for folks who are homeless. That's always going to be 1 bedrooms. Would you be unintentionally excluding them because they can't build more than 6 at a time or something? Or senior housing like next door is almost invariably 1 bedrooms. So you might want to think, are there some exceptions to it if you want to go down that path, so as to make sure you're not sort of.
There's also an underlying, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I guess I was just going to say, it sounds like, this was one of the suggestions for our upcoming work plan, where it sounds like, there's interest in it. So I think when we get to our discussion, maybe later on, we can affirm that this is something we want to have like a full discussion on. What are the pitfalls? Where would it fit? Does it apply everywhere? Are there certain numbers of units we want to like super especially prioritize? But it feels like, I kind of agree with Andrew. Like, it feels like maybe it's something we need to apply more broadly than only to the TDRs.
So again, all the more reason in my mind that you start with 1 dwelling unit here everywhere, because you can always go up. It's going to be very difficult to go down. And you might want to start simple with expanding the TDRs at 1 everywhere and continue to have some of these other conversations, and then figure out with this bedroom, with this and this, what now needs to be incentivized. Because you may be surprised. You may need to incentivize the R7 district. You don't know. So that's my last pitch.
I'll recant my original vote, and I would go with what Monica says. It does make sense, the 1 in my mind.
Yeah, go ahead,
I'll ask a
Michael.
question. Are we saying that if you buy a TDR, you must build so many 1 bedroom, so many 2 bedroom? How are you planning to use the TDR to incentivize the type of building you want?
We're not. We just had a side.
Like, to
We
me,
had a
which is-
side discussion and decided not to do that. We're going to add it to our work
Because you
plan.
can't regulate
Yeah.
the market that way.
But what Ted's now suggesting,
Yeah,
Ted and
I'm
Monica are suggesting, is to kind of get rid of this table and just go to the 1-to-1 until we're really sure
Can we come back to Paul's point? So someone who's going to build a studio or one bedroom and not, the price of that unit's going to be, far less, right, than a home in the SEQ. The portion of that price now that's going to be represented by the TDR is going to be really high. And, they're less likely then to want to do that, right? Because, right, the price of that unit is going to go up, whatever, 10, 15% rather than 2%. And then it's, unlikely to get bought. That transaction is just not going to happen because it's too expensive, right? So there is some balance there that when you come out of the SEQ and you're going into these less expensive, smaller units, the one-to-one relationship, I think, may not work.
Can I, an example that that Michael, is the conversation you had about the additional floor.
Yeah.
There was no discussion about needing an incentive. It was, if I can get an extra floor, I would absolutely buy TDRs. There was no like, if I can get it for 50% off. And if it was like, I want an extra floor. And if it takes me buying some TDRs, fine. So we don't know.
Marginal additional cost, let's say it's $12,000 for a TDR, in terms of I don't know, something that costs $175,000 each unit for a studio or whatever it is. $12,000 is, yeah, but there's the additional profit of that extra unit. It seems like the developers have figured out that it works.
How do we know that?
Well, because they said they would buy them if they could do it. And then we have one case, we did a test where somebody bought on Shelburne Road, bought a TDR for probably $15,000 just to get some extra lot coverage.
So one thing that Bernie was always great at was saying, let's put a certain thing forward. Let's get public comment on it, see if it works. And in this case, I think the more conservative path is what Ted and Monica were putting forward. We're not giving something away before somebody's asking for it. So maybe in this case, the best course is to go with the one-to-one. If we get a lot of public feedback that it's just not working, if the economics don't work, if landowners in those areas start to say, it's just not worth it for us, then we have somewhere we can go to.
Let me try and reconnect with the guy in Seattle who manages their TDR. It's him and one other guy who said, don't do it with simple arithmetic. Use it to guide your development where you want it by doing this.
Yeah.
So I could talk to them and find out
Yeah,
how it's working.
It would be interesting. And then also, I guess, like how our community seems very different than Seattle. So, how it might possibly be different in a.
Yeah. No, I would just ask him if it works.
So is there general agreement on, for right now, sticking with the one-to-one and then getting feedback? And
I would still go with the 2 at least on that top line, but again, just to try to incentivize the market. But if everyone else doesn't want to do that,
that would be my intuition too. But I mean, either way, if we're flexible to react to feedback in a nimble fashion, it's okay too, from my perspective.
That's the trick, being nimble.
Yeah, being nimble.
Well, we can be nimble, and especially in public comment, and if we do get feedback along the way, once people know we're really working on this, we can always make a change.
Okay.
Yeah, because as a reminder, Andrew, this, but when we go to public hearing, we always, within that meeting, can have the right after we hear it to make adjustments. And if they're big enough, then we don't have to have another public hearing, and we can make those changes before they're sent. And we've done that.
Okay. So we're going 1-1-1.
I don't know.
I think so. So I guess as a straw poll, who would be in favor of, for now, setting it 1-to-1?
Yeah.
Okay. And then, majority for now in the draft. Then.
So just as a quick point of clarification and not to open a different can of worms, does that eliminate the table completely, or do you keep the varying lot coverage?
Keep the table.
You keep that table, yes.
Well, not that
Keep
table,
this
the other
table.
19.2. If you go back to 19.2.
There was
Paul,
a difference in
there's
the
the
lot.
column on the right. You can use TDRs for also
Yep,
building or lot coverage. Do you basically, do you collapse the first row and the second row? And then in the middle column, it all says one dwelling unit, but then it says 10, 5 and nothing, or does that table go away completely? And it just says one dwelling unit and
No, you need to
10,000
leave.
square
I
feet.
think
I
we should
think what
keep it
you
as a
said.
placeholder.
Well, and we have
no,
the,
what you said. I liked your, yeah.
but we have the the third column
Yep.
there that's about lot and building coverage.
Yep.
That seemed fine to me.
Okay, so what's happening is in the middle column, it goes, everything says one dwelling unit.
Yeah.
The first row and the second row are collapsed into one because otherwise they're identical.
Why not just leave it as a placeholder? Just,
We're keeping it as a place. See
Right,
how the
right.
third column.
no, but I mean, not collapse the first
Oh,
and
not
second
collapse
row.
1 and 2. Okay.
Like just keep the table and just replace the 3 and the 2 with the 1. This
Sure.
way we
So then
know we had the discussion. We know we may change it based on feedback. And if so, the only thing that needs to be done is
the
change the
number.
1 to a
Hmm.
2.
So keeping the four categories of districts. Yep. I just wanted to make sure I was clear of what needs to be
About
done.
the
on my end.
half in the bottom line. Go back to that table.
I'm hearing crickets.
In the SEQ. You can always go up.
I like.
I'm
Always
sorry, I
good.
missed, what is the
Hmm?
question?
And 1
I know it's always been 1.
1992 or so.
What was the
Well, we
question?
did just
This
vote
is
multiple times on it being
All right,
one. so
let's
unless-
come to that
okay.
later on and get on
Okay,
to item 3.
so the next thing was something else. It was
So the other half of this incentives discussion is what you want to allow to be the maximum amount of development in these areas. So the last discussion was what's a TDR worth? This one becomes how much can you build on the property? So as a putting something out there, we suggested that in the highest density districts, there be no maximum period on density. So if you want to buy all the TDRs that you can in order to maximize your property within the building envelope that you're allowed to build, the maximum height, the maximum lot coverage, then go for it. That's essentially what we've done in the city center form-based code. And then in these transitional districts, that you be able to get an increase, but not unlimited, because they are sort of transitional to other types of development and housing and natural areas and things like that. So
And just as clarification, the SEQ districts remain identical to what they currently are.
Right,
There's no
unchanged.
change to the SEQ from the current program.
Can you remind me what we just did in the general PUD with the civic space? Because we had it as, because I'm thinking fine if there's no maximum because the civic space will be included and it will therefore continue. I mean,
Yep.
there's a guardrail.
Yeah. That's accurate. Yeah,
That's
there's,
remaining.
yep, that
We
there's
just
a
changed
certain,
what you can do with some of it.
there's a certain square footage that's required depending on the number of units that you have, and it's multiplied by that number of units. So yes, there is a bit of a cap created by, you can't just put 600 units by buying a bunch of, hundreds of
Because-
TDRs because you don't have any space for anything else.
So as long as that guardrail is there, it seems.
That guardrail is there, the other, setbacks and other site plan requirements, those all still exist. So the site amenity requirement is a piece of the whole regulatory puzzle that does restrict the size of the total size of a building and the total number of units based on that site amenity calculation.
well, the total size of the building, not the total.
The total
Number-
number of units
is
affects
the
how
number.
much site amenity is
Yes,
required.
yeah.
So if you have if you have 100 units, you need a lot more site amenity.
Ted?
Monica's question brings up a question. Grandview, which is west of the edge, all those single story apartments. I guess they're apartments. Let's say if the developer wanted to go, tear them all down, do 3 or 4 stories, would that then dial in? Because right now there's basically no common space. So would then that developer be required to create common space?
Yes,
Okay.
so there's a whole bunch of very undefined grassy area in those properties, but nothing that feels like common space.
Yeah.
So anytime, if somebody were to do a tear down and rebuild,
Mhm.
then yes, they would have to identify, per the new draft regulations, actual site amenity space. If they were adding 2 units to the end of a building, it would be only for those 2 units. You don't have to retroactively do things, but if they're tearing down, then yes.
That really magnifies how good I think, that provision is that we put in.
Paul, Kelsey, what would be a reason not to have a maximum? What do you see as any possible downside in terms of neighbors wouldn't expect that? I mean, is there a downside in your mind?
So I don't see a lot of downside because the building can be that size regardless. I guess if I were to say any downside, well, in the first category, I think the only downside is what you've just talked about, which is the incentive that there's no guardrail saying that you have to build some 2 or 3 bedroom units. So if sky's the limit, you might find that people start saying, before I could only build 20 units, I may as well make them 2 bedrooms. Now I can build 40. Why don't I just make them all 1 bedroom? So that's one downside. I think we don't have...
That puts a real premium on having this change be made at the same time as considering the other change.
And then I think in the other districts, there is direction given to the DRB and applicants around compatibility with neighborhoods. But, that's, it's not a hard and fast, in the R7, I'll pick a different one. In the Allen Road district, thou shalt not have more than a 3-story building. Somebody can make a case for a larger one. It then becomes subject to a discussion with the DRB, and some neighbor might say, I'm really not happy with how this thing turned out. The more that you can, if you had no cap on density, the more incentive a developer has to push for the biggest thing that they could get and, try to get some big thing. If it's a little bit capped at, say, 50%, then there's maybe a little more expectation on everybody's part as to what the biggest thing that would be. So those would be my 2. Do you have any that you'd add?
Well, just to not to add, actually, sort of to counter the
or counter.
A commercial development can already be as big as it can be. So a building could be a certain size if it's 100% commercial, and the no maximum allows you to put as many units as you want to put into the same size building. So that neighbor may be faced with the same building, just with different things in it. I also just wanted to say, I'm not positive that my understanding, and I am nowhere near an expert on construction finance, is that studio, because of the additional utility, kitchens and bathrooms and things like that, it actually can be more expensive to build 3 studios than a single 3-bedroom. So I don't think it's as cut and dry as we're talking about, that it's always cheaper to do that. So it's just something to keep in mind, that that's not necessarily always the case.
I had a clarification question, actually. Are we, by doing what we are talking about here, are we allowing additional floors? I guess I kind of just assumed that we were. And if not, we should, because you're right. If not, we're definitely encouraging smaller so that they can.
So in the urban design overlay district, which covers a big section of the first line there, you changed the rules a couple of years ago to say 5 stories as of right. So you can't go above 5 stories, but you also automatically get 5 stories. In the other districts in the next category down and some areas of the first category, the rule says 35 feet, which is really just 2 stories, but you can seek a waiver from the DRB to be taller, which can lead to 3, 4, 5.
So
the board becomes more skeptical that the higher the number goes, but they have allowed some 5s.
So are you saying in the first line, I guess put my glasses on, in the auto, the first line there,
yep,
that is all at the 5. All of the Shelburne Road?
Along Shelburne Road itself, yes. A little further back, not necessarily, but yes. So you've allowed 5 stories as of right, so that somebody doesn't have to ask the DRB for permission to be more than the 2.5 stories.
So in terms of incentives, I would ask for maybe staff's opinion on what other areas in the second category could be a good fit for that same rule as an incentive for TDRs.
I mean,
which you don't have to answer right now. I'm just saying, are there some that's an additional
I think
incentive.
that the second line better suits itself in most cases to be in that 3-story range, because you start to abut against other neighborhoods. And so to automatically say you can just be 5, I think, you know, having the ability for the board to decide on a case-by-case basis in those districts, I think is a better overall policy, because sometimes they back up against single-family homes, and then you get some really, you know,
yeah, and
if you just say they've got a right to do 5 stories, then there's very little discussion that the board can have about shadows and, you know, looming buildings over there.
That was one of the factors into how this was split up, is that everything in this, a lot of the things in the second line are more of those transitional neighborhoods or transitional areas, you know, between Shelburne Road and Spear, between, you know, places along Kennedy Drive. They are not necessarily the core of where the highest buildings may be compared to where existing, you know, 20-foot high at most single family residences are.
Just for context, what are the buildings on Allen Road? Is that Pillsbury Manor? How tall are those? Are they 4?
Pillsbury Manor are the senior housing. Yeah. Those are, I believe, 2 stories. The ones further up the street, the 2 apartment buildings, are 4 stories.
They are 4. Okay.
So it sounds like we're talking about 2 different things. One is adding height as an additional thing that someone could buy potentially. Mm-hmm. And we're also talking about this, how much extra density is someone allowed to buy? I'm not hearing anyone talk about changing the SEQ. And I'm not hearing anybody talk about the lack of maximum in the first line. So it seems like maybe we're focused in this middle line where it's the 50% more density. Is there anyone who feels like we need to make a change to that 50% more density in that second line, the second category? Or does that seem like a good starting point?
Yeah, that's good. So
again, that's restricted to the transit overlay, as we spoke about earlier?
For the R12, R7, and R7 and C.
The rest of them are entirely within the transit overlay already.
So just make that clear in the chart.
Yeah.
You know, this is where I do think a math analysis would be helpful, because with our civic space requirement, at what, you know, if we're already, are we forcing smaller units with this incentive? We don't know what that, like at what.
I mean, it would require analyzing every available.
No, but if you just do it by acre, like we just said, well, let's say it's a 1 acre parcel.
So on a 1 acre parcel, it'll require, you can get 18 in the R12, you can get 10 in the R7. You can get 18 in the AR, you can get 10 in the Swift.
No, but my question is, with the 15% for civic space, right? or the X number of feet, it's X number of feet.
It's square
civic
footage
space.
per unit. Yep.
Okay, that's the number I'm thinking about.
But it depends on, it
Know what I'm saying?
varies based on the number of units in the building. There's 3 different levels. And then there's other questions about parking and stormwater and site conditions and natural resources. And there's a lot of other inputs, not just a square flat 1 acre.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to consider, Monica, is that as something gets more dense, there becomes possibly more creative solutions around these things. So for instance, I was just last week talking with somebody in the city center form-based code where they're building a underground parking, and the down ramp, they're going to cover it. And that covering will be at the first level of living, and that's where their site amenities are going to be. So it's going to be on top of their parking, which on a mathematical calculation of acreage, we could never have imagined. But for them, they saw, oh, you know, if I put it up here, if I build X number of units, I can afford to do underground parking. If I do underground parking, then I've got a ramp. And if I have a ramp, then I've got a civic space. It becomes this sort of like more creativity as you get urban. And so I don't know that I'd be comfortable giving this is what happens as it gets more urban, because, you know, that's why people hire architects.
Right. Well, so all the more, I mean, personally, I'm comfortable with more height, more whatever, everything. It would sure feel much better doing that if we knew that we were requiring a mix of unit size, unit numbers of units, because then we just knew it was there, and they'd have to be creative in fitting that in. It seems to me like what they can play with to make things fit in their creativity is creating smaller units.
Right, well, we did say we're gonna talk
I know,
about
so
that.
I'm just keeping it in mind when we're adding these things, because I would be all for adding more height as an offering. That seems to be something people are really interested in. And I think that could be a big seller, right? So is that like a TDR stage 2? Because again, if we offer the height and then we put in later some kind of thing, well, you can have height as long as you add 2 bedrooms. That again, I understand that becomes more complicated. So
I guess my request would be, right now you've got 2 categories of the ways you can use TDRs. I would request from a functionality way that you not do more than 2, because the number of scenarios that staff needs to understand to work with developers to say, if you move this and then this and then this, we have to build really, really complicated tables to make every scenario work and have to be able to explain it to everybody. So I just say,
keep don't talk about height right now as an incentive,
or take out something else. I guess I'm just saying the more different things that you have, the more that it becomes really difficult to work with the development community to help them understand every option that they can do.
But there is also a
You've got
question.
building bulk in there already, right? Which would cover.
Yes, I mean, the DRB has the authority to grant height waivers in multiple districts already. And so if somebody bought more units, then they would get the waivers essentially with them. To have the 2 interplay with one another, to say you can buy X units and also the height, becomes a very complicated math of, somebody says, oh, what if I made the building shorter but wider? I'll add the units this way, taller but skinnier. It just becomes very, very difficult to manage.
It also potentially creates a situation where if you go and you ask the DRB, you could get it for free, or you could pay for it and get it. It just creates some kind of economic games with, if I ask the DRB nicely, then I could get it without paying anything, where instead I could pay for it. And it just makes it a bit more complex when you could end up with a effectively similar outcome.
So I just bring up again Michael's conversation with the developer, and he said, gee, if I could have gotten an extra floor, I would have paid. So I think it's a low hanging fruit and something to Mark to come back to at some point.
Right. Are we ready to move on to the third question?
Yeah, I just have one question, Jessica. So I think this makes all the sense in the world. Building denser in these areas, coupled with be able to conserve. I mean, like they're all, that sounds like exactly the way that we should go. Just a question though is, would it make sense to do some analysis to ask the question, what will South Burlington look like, assuming all this was built? How many people will we have, and what would the traffic be, and what would our schools look like, and just to project out a little bit, like what does this imply about what our city will look like before we finally decide if yes, this does make sense.
It will look different versus if they were all built in the SEQ as 4-bedroom homes. I know.
I understand, but but it is, I don't know like what no maximum means, how many people, right? Just that implies, and in all these districts, and does that imply the city goes from a population of 20,000 to 40,000 and 2 high school? Like, should we have a sense of what that implies before we finally agree this is the way to go?
Well, just as a quick clarification, none of this is increasing the sending areas. The sending areas exist, and they've been established by the existing program somewhere around 1,400. I'll call it 13 to 1,500. So that's 1,400 dwelling units. So yes, maybe it shifts traffic from one place to the other, but it's not creating new development potential.
You're saying, look, the maximum you can get is 1,400 units, and I don't know how many people per unit. I don't know. The most you're going to get is another 5,000-6,000 folks.
But it's not additional. It's moving.
Well, it probably is additional, because the likely result in reality is that many of those 1,400 would have not been used.
You're moving from what to what?
A transferable development rights by definition is transferring a development right. So it's the right to develop to build a house in the southeast quadrant to building an apartment.
No, but the NRP you can't build in today, right? And so the 1,400 probably would not.
Transferring a
right probably wouldn't be used,
right? But it was the intent when it was first established that those could all be used. So those 1,400 homes were contemplated. I agree with you that the likelihood that they would exist now, but in 2006, when it was put forward, the idea was, we hope they'll all get used. I think your question's a really interesting one, especially if you go back to the thing you previously voted on. If you make it 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, then you are allowing more development.
Yeah,
true.
It's interesting that, to me, the question becomes more temporal than under none of these scenarios is all of it going to happen in 2 years' time. There's macroeconomics that will sort of lead to how many homes per year get built, but so you're probably not going to massively shift the market to where twice as many total homes get built every year, because there's still going to be a market.
Kelsey grounded me in the fact that there's a maximum number of TDRs, which is 1,400, which translates into a maximum increase, of whatever, 5,000. So that actually probably feels like it won't be extreme.
Yeah, I do think that if we started using those TDRs for other stuff, like extra floors or something like that, we may be allowing for more development than we would be under the current zoning. So
I think Andrew's is onto something that we've never kind of looked at, is what's the end game? Where are we going when we've built these 1,400 units? Is that it? And when we built these 1,400 units, or whatever the number is, it doesn't matter. What will the impact be on our infrastructure, cost of infrastructure, and the management, and on our taxes, on our traffic, on our pollution? We've never actually thought about, which is really more sophisticated planning than we've been doing, but
recently
probably something that needs doing. Because I think it's more important, because I think we're going to face a lot of pressure in South Burlington, well, Vermont in general, but we are, because it's desirable, from climate refugees, whether they're wealthy climate refugees from the coastline that's going to be inundated, or refugees in a true sense whose lands where they lived are now underwater and they've got to go somewhere else. We need to be prepared for that. And so the 1,400 units may be all very nice to talk about now, but it could be 3 times that, because we have to accept more people, or we don't, or we decide we cannot.
Ted?
Yeah, just a couple points. I agree. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I had been mentioning the importance of having parks, you know, as we build out with the fear that we suddenly have 6,000 to 10,000 more people. Where do they recreate and so on? So a valid point. But you know, one of the things that might be a good idea is the economic committee. That's not the right term, but whatever that committee is, maybe the city council could request them to start doing some calculating and visioning with regard to, you know, the infrastructure, if we do have X number of people, or at least the known amount of units that we're going to have, to give us some sort of guideline. But the reality is that we are adding more and more people, and we have to really, and this is one of the priorities I think that some people have, is that, you know, a park study, or to figure out, okay, well, meanwhile, let's start looking at parks and open space to provide for these people. So valid point, probably not the night to make the decision, but we should start thinking about that, figure out how we can.
Yeah. Duncan?
No, I just want to add my 2 cents on that too. I mean, I agree with you, Michael. I think we're going to be under pretty intense pressure for development, for housing. And, you know, how we deal with that and where we look to put it can make a big difference in the outcome. You know, and I think that's something we probably do need to look at, because South Burlington is a very popular place. People want to move here, and I don't think that demand is going to diminish. You know, whether that increases our school population, it depends, you know, the ages of the people moving here, but, you know, it's how and where we put that housing make a big difference.
It's one of the reasons I don't have a problem with height.
Yeah.
And obviously there's something, I've already mentioned it in my wish list, that there are some parts of the city which need to be rezoned for not high rise in the traditional sense, but higher rise buildings than we're currently allowing. I mean, what about, let's say, what's that big Heritage Motors or whatever the hell they're called down on Shelburne Road? Mm-hmm. They've got a showroom on Shelburne Road, and they've got acres of cars standing around. Maybe the future of car dealerships is to have a showroom with one of each model and nothing in the yard. So if those properties were developed, so the sky's the limit. Those are the kinds of places that we might need to accommodate more people in a denser environment, and incentivize the dealerships to go somewhere else.
Well, so I guess the bigger question is, so, you know, I think our stated goal here was to fix the TDR program, find locations where TDRs could go that are appropriate. And I think there's some great side conversations, but I mean, I think unless we're choosing to put height in here, which is, I think needs its own analysis before we just start going and raising heights around the city. It's something that people are very sensitive to. Feels like, you know, that maybe is a work plan item.
Yeah, you can't do it everywhere.
Yeah, okay. Pick your so it sounds like height is maybe a future conversation, and I'm not hearing any current changes to this table here. Yep. So our third question was, we're allowed to reduce minimum allowable lot sizes. Is this something we want to do? Is there some kind of reason to do that?
So
it wasn't from your committee. Literally
the only reason that it was included as a question is because it is something that is allowed by state statute. It's the only thing allowed that a municipality can allow TDRs to be used for under Vermont statute that our draft TDR ordinance does not specifically speak to. Monica's looking at me. The height can be included, but it's sort of more of a building related question.
I honestly, I cannot picture what this means. I have been struggling with it. What does it mean? Can you give me an example? Because I am.
It doesn't it's.
No, like where, just give, is there like where's a place? Reduce the minimal.
So if something is required to be if there's a minimum lot size in a zone that's required to be a half an acre, you could use a TDR to make it a quarter acre.
So the most common usage of this in Vermont would be many of the smaller towns talk about density not in terms of units per acre, but acres for a lot. That's the way they think about density. So you've got your 4-acre zone, your 10-acre zone, your 25-acre zone, and you can put a house on that lot. So in a rural Vermont town, you would look at this and say, well, instead of being the 4-acre zone, you make it the 2-acre zone. You're essentially doubling your density that way. I think given the last conversation that we just had about sort of the complexities and the fact that the general PUD allows you to have the flexibility here, and frankly, if there's an issue, it might be simpler to just eliminate or reduce minimum lot sizes without having to pay for it, that we were just flagging this for you to know that it's an option, but not necessarily advocate.
If we do get to, it's not an infill PUD, but if we get to talking about options for smaller acres, I absolutely think this is critical to bring back at that point as an option. That this would be a very, very good way, and there could be a lot of appetite for that.
You're saying specifically for TDRs or just the general idea of allowing for smaller lots as long as they're
it helps the TDR marketplace to permanently conserve our NRP, I'm all for that. I just think the concept is important for that conversation. If, for example, an R2 is ever allowed to by right downsize to an R4, then I think it's worth revisiting it at that time, but we're not talking about that.
And
now.
I mean, maybe we'd identify at that time if our lot sizes that are allowed are even a problem, which I'm not sure that they are in our city. So maybe that's part of that small lot or infill discussion.
Right.
I've never seen it in any of the TDR ordinances that I read. I've never seen this, and I have a concern that it's further fragmentation of the parcels we've got. We don't need to reduce the lot size in order to get the density we want. So I don't see a need for this, or why we would want to do it in terms of a TDR ordinance.
Okay, so it sounds like not now, but we did say as a group we were going to circle back to infill, just because we had kind of given up on infill for a little while. So maybe as part of that infill discussion, we'll just make sure there isn't a lot size issue.
Well, infill in low density districts is what you're not dealing with right now. That's totally different from infill on Shelburne Road, which you are dealing with right now. Just to be.
Yes, thank you.
I don't want to.
Yes, thank you.
The word can mean a lot of different things to different people.
Yes.
So the answer to that is no for now.
No for now, but let's keep it on the
parking lot. So we're getting late. It's already after 9. We do have some more stuff on our agenda, including discussion of the fiscal year 23 priorities and work plan. I guess I'm wondering how much of this we want to get into now. I'd been kind of strategizing with Kelsey about what the plan was for here. And I think it was really super great that everyone kind of thought about this already and has their kind of lists put together. I guess I was thinking for tonight, we would maybe each say a little bit about why, like what we put forward as our priorities. And then at our next meeting, or, the next time it comes up, whether it's the next meeting or the one after that, we would kind of have the things that were identified that were not on our fiscal year 22 list, kind of added to the fiscal year 22 list so that we have kind of the things we were already working on, as well as any items that were identified to be added, kind of all together in like a more comprehensive format that we could review kind of as a whole. So I think I was pleased that a lot of people had put forward ideas that were kind of things we were working on already or had kind of already identified as priorities. So that was helpful. So I'm not sure how much we do want to get into tonight just because it's getting late, or if people want to maybe just introduce some their ideas if they're new ideas, maybe. Is that, or Kelsey, do you have a, yeah,
sure. So I did put together a list of things that I and different people brought up different aspects of these things. They're a little more generalized, and I only did this afternoon, so it hasn't been circulated. There were a few things that were raised that I saw as different enough or in addition to things that were in the fiscal year 22 work plan to raise as, to flag as sort of new projects, as opposed to projects we didn't get to in 22 or projects that are sort of underway but didn't get too far. So I guess maybe if I just list those few, there's only a handful. If anyone wants to talk to those specific new things, maybe that's what we do today. And then I can put that all together. If any of that is stuff that we want to include in the list for consideration in the next meeting, that's when I can put together sort of the topic area. This is what the steps would be in 23 and kind of get the ball rolling on those projects. Does that make sense, Jessica?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so the few things that I had.
Is there something I can pull up on the screen so people can follow along? Is one of the things that you sent to the commission?
I think it
No.
only came to me
It only went to Jessica this afternoon. But I can.
So I think the idea was that many of the things that people specifically listed are kind of already in the table and we've already chipped away at or identified as a project in the past. So we wanted to make sure that anything that was a new project was included.
So I didn't finish the third column, but these are the few things that I received from different commissioners that I thought were either building on something or were entirely new. And this is just my own, analysis from this afternoon. So I listed climate change mitigation. So that's actually taking steps in our planning commission regulations, in the comp plan and other things. What's currently in the fiscal year 22 plan is effectively supporting the climate action task force and their process. So them actually taking mitigating steps. I did list as, it's clearly related, but it is slightly new. There is an ongoing question about a density calculation in the SCQ, the so-called 1.8 acre issue. That's also considered part of an umbrella, cleanup of small things in the LDRs that was in the fiscal year 22. Regulating owner occupation of housing, condo units as opposed to apartment units, things like that. Diversity of housing types, which is fairly self-explanatory, and Jessica alluded to it earlier. That includes sort of bedroom diversity, types of housing that are available in the city. Is there anything missing? Is there anything underrepresented? And kind of taking a holistic look at that. City growth targets, whether there are growth targets, how they match with the current comp plan, with the current LDRs, other plans for infrastructure that we have. Review of uses in commercial districts. That is coming primarily from the few zoning change requests that we received at last meeting. Basically exploring the mixed industrial commercial district, the industrial open space district, what uses are allowed there, how things are defined, how uses are defined in those areas, a review of residential uses in those areas. That is closely related but slightly distinct from the study of industrial only, the possibility of having industrial only areas that is in the fiscal year 22 plan. So this is kind of a broadening of that question. And then summaries of the LDRs, and that is a project. It came from Paul Engels, who's not here tonight, as a suggestion to create more user-friendly guides or FAQs or something else that at least at a minimum applies to the more common questions or more common things that people want to do in the city. If you want to add a deck on your property, what do you need to do? Like,
although for the record, I would say we built a bunch of those last year on those common ones. So we do have those as one-page guides.
Yep.
So I like, before that's a new project, I would love the opportunity to show with you what we have done.
Yep.
So I just want to be clear that, we've been working on
and
those exact things.
Paul's actual request, which was in the other documents that I did send to the entire planning commission, is effectively distilling the whole LDRs into a 50-page plain English document. That may or may not be useful, but that is what he asked for, and this is how I summarized it. So everything in this table is my own characterizations of these requests. So if anyone claims ownership of any of these topics and wants to clarify, I think this would be a great opportunity to talk about that. But this is how I interpreted things that were submitted to me. And just to be totally clear, this is not including any of this. As soon as my computer, these are all the things that were already in the fiscal year 22. Now I've gone too far. Work plan that would still be under consideration and were highlighted by several commissioners. So those are the new guys.
A question for you and or Paul. Is adding an allowed use in a district easier than making a zoning change?
It is a zoning change. It's a change to something. It's a change to something that's allowed in the district. It's easier in that logistically you could just check a different box in the table of uses, but it still requires the same
process,
review process,
public hearing and all the rest of it.
It's still a change to the LDRs. You don't have to write anything new, but it is a change.
Is there,
I mean, it could be done. Would it be quicker than to make to add an allowed use rather than to go through the whole process of a full zoning change it from one zone to another?
I guess what I would say, Michael, is it obviously depends on what that use change is, but if it's similar to things that are already allowed, they can be really simple. You made a change last year to allow for cultural facilities along Shelburne Road. Every commissioner in 3 seconds said, well, of course we would love for a museum to exist there. Why not? If you were to take an industrial area and say, what if we allowed residential there? That could be a substantial debate. I think it's sort of a scale question.
Okay. Hey, this is sort of overwhelming. I mean, there's so many. I haven't seen one thing that I disagree with out of all these, and every single one is in some ways a priority in my mind. Is there some way that, I mean, some of these could be combined. I was thinking certain items, again, Duncan talking about UVM, that's on my mind as well, about being proactive. Maybe we could again have that economic committee, if I could figure out the name of it, but that would be
Economic Development Committee.
Excellent, thank you. You love that word, development. But so maybe we could delegate to some committees while things are in the hopper to get some of this stuff. I mean, because it's so overwhelming, I'm almost frozen.
There's also, I completely understand where you're coming from, and it is a very long list. There are a lot of projects that you can take bites out of. You know, it's explore the scope of the project. It's initiate a dialogue with UVM, like things that would take small amounts of time or small amounts of staff work and then an approval by the planning commission that move some of these things forward, but don't take several meetings worth of work. There are other things that do take several meetings worth of work if you wanted to get it fully accomplished in fiscal year 23. So that's what I would intend to be doing for the next meeting, is identifying what those bites are that could happen in fiscal year 23, keeping in mind that probably half of the commission's time will be taken by the comp plan.
Which is a form of moving many of these forward, as this is the policy direction of the next decade. Like, it's not a separate project.
No, it's not a separate project. It's a more forward thinking policy project, when some of these are more action oriented projects that come out of the current comp plan, or maybe are not in the current comp plan, but are flagging something that should be in the next comp plan. So they're all these things are interrelated. But point being, all of these things don't need to be completed in 23 for them to be moved forward to some extent.
Well, then the second part of my point is that maybe, again, you and Paul could really highlight what you both feel really absolutely critical over the next 12 months. And then the rest we can fill in, but that would certainly help me.
Well, and I think, Ted, to add one last piece to this, a big part of the council's idea of establishing citywide policy priorities is for this to become an iterative process over time of saying, boy, we have so many things we need to do in this area. Maybe we need to budget to allocate more resources to this area. We need to establish a permanent committee. We need to help the city get, I'll pick the first one on the list. Climate change is going to be, if 1/10 of what the Climate Action Committee is working on is going to be followed through, that's going to take substantial resources that don't exist today. That's perfectly fine. That's the whole point of prioritizing and saying, we were only able to get to 1% of the things. That's not going to hit the goal. We're going to have to now, through the budgeting process and through the council identifying resources, figure out how to ramp that up. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Is there something that we could actually, on that list, that we could complete tonight? Like the name change? Is it just a matter of somebody making a motion and our voting on it?
No, unfortunately.
Why not?
I have had a brief conversation with the city attorneys, and it is more complex than that. Yeah.
So we can't vote
That
tonight.
was your first mistake, was consulting the city attorney.
The number of times this commission has asked me to go talk to the city attorneys, I figured that was a safe bet.
Yes,
Actually,
yes, it's good. It was a good call to talk to the attorneys. We're not admonishing you for
In
that.
3 or 4 words, why is it more complicated?
Can I suggest that?
There are significant cross.
Yeah, let's have a separate.
That's a whole.
Yeah,
because
we'll
I
get into
think
it.
the
That's another
point of this
agenda
point of the
item.
discussion was to highlight
Right.
new things.
Yeah.
Just to
But Duncan, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was looking at this list and getting very nervous, but you've massaged my nervousness a little bit, Paul, by saying a lot of this could go with the comp plan, because I'm dubious the comp plan is only going to take 50% of our time, especially as we get closer to the end. So my hope would be that if you guys, if we could look at it through that lens, knowing that we're probably not going to have as much time as we think, and see 2 things. What you think on here is really critical, that would be helpful to highlight, and what could we delegate? Because I'd rather under promise and over deliver than take on a ton of stuff and realize we just don't have time for it.
Yeah.
If you guys could look at it through that lens and come back with some feedback on that, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, both Ted and Duncan. And, I think that we started last year to have kind of those different columns that outlines like, what's this year's goal? And is there another committee maybe that can be tasked? I think that that'll be critical here.
Well, right. And I would say committee, and this is Jesse's problem, but committee and staff,
Yeah.
because a committee being tasked to do something without the resources to do it effectively puts them in a really hard spot.
Yeah.
So I think that's the pairing of those things.
Right.
And can I just add for this, but which will also prepare us for comp plan, I feel like we've really been working in a hurried vacuum during IZ, right? I mean, we've all been talking amongst ourselves and making decisions and saying, well, maybe this, maybe that. Okay, because we've had to work against the clock. And I think I could certainly use some perspective from different people with different experiences that can teach us, is there, whether it's the Economic Development Committee, is there, listening to this whole beta thing was really, and the, the on logic, it's just very interesting and helpful. And it opens my mind to it helps connect dots. So if there's a way to build into the agendas, just interesting topics that are coming up, whether it's at the state level or not, that we are being briefed on, I think that would be a really good use of our time. Yeah, that relate to the topics.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that we haven't talked a ton about is the comprehensive plan, but, I see within that one line item that says comprehensive plan, there being a lot of that, like meeting with the different committees, maybe having experts come in and like help us like work on goals for particular areas, or the climate action change committee. I'm excited about starting out with just some visioning within our group. Ted had kind of suggested that might be nice to do a little bit more of a retreat style visioning of us, like at the beginning, that can help us kind of form the goals piece. And then, we have been so focused on LDR changes, which are very technical. And the comp plan is a really different process. It's really about visioning, about hearing from the community, about working with the other committees. And it'll be kind of a shift for us as a group.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and can I offer that I'm on another advisory board, and I know advisory boards are doing this more and more now, is when they get into these phases, they're taking kind of an assessment of themselves, looking at diversity, are they or not? And it's not to penalize a board if they're not, but it's to then register that, have us all acknowledge, okay, gee, like I made a comment earlier today, thinking that nobody lived in the urban overlay district, yet here we are making all this policy. Now Paul does, but that if we at least all acknowledge, like, okay, so let's acknowledge that we don't, is there something that we should be aware of as we're going into comp plan mode, that can we recognize that maybe there's knowledge we should gain from people that do, right? Like, so it's a common exercise that boards are doing, and I can provide some more detail on it, but I think that would be very helpful across the board for this group to do at that point.
Interesting. Okay, so I think that might be a good place to leave off for tonight, and then come back with the bigger list with some kind of more manageable tasks for us to talk about in more detail next time.
Question. Paul mentioned, that you're likely to require additional resources, and we talked about the Economic Development Committee. They may not have the personnel qualified to do what we want them to do, and the city might have to then hire some pretty high-level consulting. Is that something that could be done, could be on the cards? Because some of it is quite complicated.
Yes, with the asterisks of, the voters approved a budget for next year.
Yep.
So there is some room, but it's not an unlimited, unlimited thing. But there's always room to be creative and thoughtful.
And there's some consulting budget to help us with things.
I'm not thinking of McKinsey or Ernst & Young, but
the funding from the state, does that include the specific project?
The grant,
yeah.
You're talking about the ARPA funds. I don't know that they have determined exactly where that can be assigned. There are grant programs that the state puts forward for planning projects where you can hire consultants, and we have been pretty successful when we've done it in the past. We can certainly do something like that. If we wanted to say we want to hire a consultant to work with us to look at commercial industrial areas and how we could have ancillary services to support them, or to do an economic analysis, those are all things that can be done. The more that we have ideas in the first, say, the next 3 months on that, the better position we are for when the grants come around in the late summer to say, this is the one we're going to do.
Something that would be a great direction to go. Cool.
Great. So thank you all. I know it's got a little late, but not as bad as sometimes. I think we made good progress and we have no other business, so we can adjourn. Thank you. Great first meeting, Andrew.
Sorry before you adjourn, was there anybody online who wanted to say anything?
Darn.
Sorry.
Okay, well, I guess before I adjourn, was there any public comment that we missed?
I did notice that Sarah had her hand up at some point in the meeting and we were talking. I know. And then I was going to look and now she's gone. So she may have, her question may have been answered.
Oh, we have someone?
Roseanne, did you have something you want to say?
Well, I sent something in the chat as you were talking about the issue of what would 6,000 more people, or that sounds good to you, or whatever, is that, we live on a finite planet and we only have a limited amount of resources available. You talked a lot about the economics. You didn't say anything about the environmental impact of what 6,000 more people would do, especially in light of the climate crisis. Our waters, all our waterways are degraded. Lake Champlain's in trouble. We're losing our soils. We're losing our trees. And if you don't think 6,000 more people is going to make an impact tremendously on the environment, then maybe you ought to farm that out to the Natural Resource and Conservation Committee, or another group in the city that looks at climate change impacts and environmental impacts in addition to the economic impacts. And by the way, if you don't know this, our schools are so overcrowded now. And if you're going to add 6,000 more people, they're going to be children. I don't know where you're going to put them, or where that school's going to be, or the more fire, another fire department, or more police, or there are consequences to what you are talking about. And if you don't address those, then you're going to leave somebody else with a big bill to pay environmentally. So that was my comment. Just consider the environment and the climate on an equal or greater footing than the economics of what you're talking about for our city. And one other thing, what you're doing will affect what South Burlington looks like. I think Andrew or somebody mentioned that. You're going to change the city is already changing, and how important is that? And I think the people who live here would consider that very important, to change from being a small, partly rural area to a mostly dense urban area. Is that what the people want? Anyway, big questions I hope you consider as you make plans for the city. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roseanne. That is really helpful. And I think that, based on what I saw Andrew had written down about the build out analysis and the impacts, I think your intention was to include the environmental impacts in that analysis as well. So yes, I think that is being added to the work plan list there. So thank you, and have a great night. We are adjourned.